Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Let's get comfy and relaxed and let's begin. Story 1. Yellowstone is beautiful in the fall. Golden leaves, crisp air, and trails that make you feel like you're the last person on Earth. That's exactly why I chose to go solo. I wanted silence, space, a chance to clear my head. It was supposed to be a simple 2-day hike. In and out, no stress. The first day went smoothly. I found a good spot to set up camp, right by a stream. Cooked my dinner. Watched the fire dance until my eyelids grew heavy. But then the fog rolled in. Not a slow creep, like morning mist over a lake. This was sudden. A thick, choking wall of gray that swallowed the trees, the ground, even the firelight. Within minutes, I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. It was unnatural. Then I heard footsteps. Soft at first, a crunch of leaves, the shift of dirt, circling my campsite. Slow, deliberate. I sat up fast, my breath catching in my throat. Hello. Silence. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the fog. Nothing, just the swirling gray. The fire barely cast a glow anymore, as if the fog had swallowed the light too. Another step. Closer. I stood up. Who's there? No answer. Just the sound of breathing. Slow, raspy, like someone with a throat full of dust. I held the flashlight with a death grip and stepped toward the sound. My foot barely touched the dirt when I saw her. A woman, standing perfectly still. Her dress was old-fashioned, tattered, hanging off her like it had been through 100 storms. She was barefoot, her pale skin smudged with dirt. Her hair was matted, tangled over her face. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She was just there. I took a step forward. My boot crunched on the ground. She vanished. Not faded. Not walked away. Just gone. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The fog was too thick, pressing in on all sides. I was suddenly drenched in cold sweat. Then, hot breath on my neck. I felt it real heavy close. A shiver crawled down my spine, and before I could think, I bolted. I don't remember running. I don't remember grabbing my gear. 1 second, I was at the campsite. The next, I was sprinting through the woods, tripping over roots, gasping for air. The fog chased me, clinging to my skin like wet cloth. I ran until my lungs burned, until I could see the glow of dawn breaking through the trees. When I finally stopped, I realized something. I wasn't at my campsite. My tent was gone. My fire pit, my pack, everything. I retraced my steps, half crazed, heart pounding. And when I finally found my campsite, I stopped cold. My tent was still there, but it had been ripped to shreds. The fabric hung in tatters, shredded like something with claws had torn through it. My sleeping bag was flayed open, the stuffing spilling out like entrails. My pack was upturned, the contents strewn across the ground. And right in the middle of it all, footprints. Bare, human, footprints, leading out of my tent and into the fog. I never camped alone again. Story 2. I've been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 12 years. In that time, I've dealt with just about everything. Lost hikers, wild animal encounters, drunk campers who think they can wrestle a grizzly, But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever made me want to quit my job as much as what happened on the South Boundary Trail in late September. It started with a call from dispatch. A hiker had reported hearing whispers along the trail, just past the tree line, around dusk. He said he was alone, but the voices had surrounded him, moving through the trees. At first, he thought it was another group nearby, but when he called out, the voices stopped, just cut off completely. He got spooked and made his way back to his car as fast as he could. We get weird reports all the time, so I wasn't too concerned. Probably just the wind through the trees, right? Or his own paranoia playing tricks on him. I told dispatch I'd check it out. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and bear spray, then set off down the trail just as the sun was setting. Glacier gets unnervingly quiet at night. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the occasional hoot of an owl or snap of a twig underfoot. That night was no different, except for one thing. I kept feeling like I was being watched. It started a mile in. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had that prickling sensation you get when someone's standing right behind you. I stopped, turned, shone my light around. Nothing but trees. Then I looked down. Footprints. Bare human footprints, pressed deep into the dirt. They weren't there before. I knelt down, my stomach tightening. The prints were fresh, crisp edges, no debris inside. I ran my light along the trail, following them. They appeared about 5 feet behind where I just walked, then continued alongside my path for another 10 feet before vanishing completely. I've tracked animals before. I know how prints work. Someone, or something, had been walking beside me, then just disappeared. That's when I heard it. The whispering. It was faint at first, drifting through the trees like smoke. A low murmur, just beyond understanding. The words were foreign, guttural, like something spoken from the back of the throat. I called out, "Hello." The voices stopped. I stood there, flashlight sweeping the trees, my breath loud in the silence. My hand was on my bear spray, but somehow I knew this wasn't an animal. I turned to leave. I'd report the footprints, the whispers, maybe have another ranger check it out in the morning. Then something grabbed me. Not just grab, clawed. A burning pain shot down my forearm. I yelled, stumbling back, flashlight dropping into the dirt. I swung blindly with my free hand, but I hit nothing. There was nothing there. I snatched up my flashlight and aimed it at my arm. For deep, bleeding scratches ran from my wrist to my elbow, like something with long, thin fingers that tried to wrap around my arm. My breath hitched. My pulse was a hammer against my ribs. I staggered back a few steps, trying to make sense of it. The whispering started again, closer this time, louder, like it was coming from right next to me. I fumbled for my radio, clicked the button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Hayes, Static. Just dead, crackling static. My hand was shaking now. I turned and ran. Branches lashed at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I kept my flashlight pointed forward, breath heaving. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Not one set, not two, a dozen, slapping against the dirt, crunching leaves, gaining on me. I didn't look back. I wouldn't look back. I sprinted the whole way, lungs burning, legs screaming. The whispering followed me all the way to the trailhead. When I reached my truck, I practically dove inside, locking the doors behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps. I forced myself to look up. There, at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights, was a figure, not moving, not breathing, just watching. Then, as quickly as I blinked, it was gone. The next day, I told my supervisor everything. He didn't say much, just nodded, then pulled a file from his desk. The top report? A ranger, back in 1983, described the exact same thing. Whispering, footprints, something unseen scratching his arm. I put in my resignation the following week. Story 3. It was supposed to be a quiet night, a peaceful retreat into the wilderness. That's what I told myself as I set up camp deep in the Smoky Mountains, far from the nearest town. The last stretch of road, so winding and narrow that I had to white-knuckle the steering wheel to keep from sliding off into the trees. But once I got there, it was worth it. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in my nostrils, and the fire I built crackled pleasantly, throwing long, flickering shadows over the clearing. I was alone, just me, the trees, and the quiet hum of the forest. Or so I thought. It must have been close to midnight when I first noticed him. A man, standing just at the edge of the firelight, still as a statue. He wore an old-fashioned park ranger uniform, the kind you see in black and white photos, the fabric stiff and faded, the badge dull. His hat sat low over his face, casting a shadow that swallowed his features. I felt a jolt of surprise, but not fear. Not yet. "Hey," I called. "You okay out there?" He didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't breathe, just stood there. I swallowed, feeling the fire's warmth at my back. Something about him wasn't right. I couldn't say what, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to not step past the edge of the light. "Sir," I tried again. My voice came out weaker than I intended. "You need help." Nothing. A wave of unease settled in my chest, thick and heavy. Maybe he was some old ranger doing night patrols. But why wouldn't he answer? Why was he just standing there? I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam right at him. And then, he was gone. Not like he turned and walked away. Not like he ducked behind a tree. 1 second he was standing there. The next, nothing. The forest was empty. A chill skated on my spine. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been, my breath coming short and fast. Finally, I turned off the flashlight and backed up toward my tent, my ears straining for any sound beyond the fire's crackle. I barely slept that night. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of wind through the leaves made my heart pound. But the rest of the night passed without incident, and when the first fingers of sunlight stretched through the trees, I packed up my gear and practically ran back to my car. By the time I reached the park office, my nerves were shot. The ranger behind the desk looked up with mild interest as I walked in, my sleeping bag still clutched in my arms. "Rough night?" he asked. I hesitated. Saying it out loud felt ridiculous, but I forced myself to speak. "There was a man at my campsite last night. A park ranger. Or someone dressed like one." The ranger's expression didn't change. "You talked to him?" I shook my head. He wouldn't answer me. Just stood there. When I shined my flashlight on him, he was gone. That was when the ranger's face paled. The easy, half-interested expression slipped away, replaced by something much colder. He glanced toward the back office, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. What did he look like? I swallowed hard. Old uniform. Tall. Just standing there. The ranger exhaled sharply through his nose and rubbed the back of his neck. That sounded like Ranger Ellis. I blinked. Who? The ranger hesitated. Ellis was one of ours. Went missing about 40 years ago. Search teams combed these woods for weeks, but they never found a trace. No body, no gear, nothing. It was like he just vanished. A shiver ran through me. You're saying he's still out there? The ranger didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his fingers tapping against the desk. Finally, he said, "You're not the first to see him." I felt my stomach drop. Campers, hikers, even some of the older rangers. People see him sometimes, always just standing there, watching. But the moment someone tries to get a better look, poof, gone. I stared at him, my mouth dry. What does he want? The ranger shrugged. Who knows? Maybe he's lost. Maybe he doesn't know he's gone. A cold weight settled in my chest. I turned and left without another word, walking briskly to my car. I told myself I'd come back, that I wouldn't let one weird experience keep me from enjoying the mountains. But that was a lie. I haven't been back since. Story 4. I woke up to the sound of screaming. Not a normal scream, either. Not the kind you hear in a horror movie, all high-pitched and over the top. No, this was real. Raw. It sounded like someone was being torn apart, their throat already shredded from too much pain. At first, I thought it was a dream. That weird space between sleep and wakefulness where your mind plays tricks on you. But then I heard it again. A long, drawn-out wail that made my skin prickle. I sat up in my tent, heart hammering. My first thought was that someone was in trouble. Maybe an animal attack. Maybe someone fell. I wasn't exactly deep in Yosemite, but it was far enough from the main trails that if someone was hurt, they'd need help. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The air outside was cold, crisp, and smelled like damp earth. The campfire from earlier had died down to a few glowing embers. My buddy Jake was still passed out in his tent, snoring softly. The scream came again. I turned my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Deeper in the woods, past the tree line where the pines stood thick and the ground sloped downward in an untouched wilderness. I hesitated. Every rational part of my brain told me not to go, that someone else would hear it, that I wasn't trained to help anyway. But something about the scream, it wasn't just pain, it was begging. So I walked toward it. The forest was dark, too dark. The trees blotted out the moon, and my flashlight barely cut through the blackness. The ground was soft with dead leaves and damp moss. Every step felt muffled, absorbed into the earth like the woods themselves didn't want me there. Then I saw it. A tree, a massive, ancient oak that didn't belong in this part of the forest. Yosemite was filled with towering pines, but this thing was old, wrong. Its gnarled branches twisted like clawed hands reaching for the sky. The bark was cracked and blackened in places, like it had been burned, but never fully destroyed. And it was screaming. I swear to God, the sound was coming from the tree itself. It wasn't just one voice anymore either. It was dozens, layered over each other. Men, women, children, some crying, some whispering, some begging. Help us. Let us out. Please. I stepped closer, heart pounding so hard I could feel in my throat. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the bark moved, like something was underneath it. A face, a human face, stretched and distorted, its mouth open in a silent, endless scream. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The face was gone. Just bark now. Rough, cracked, harmless. I should have left. I should have turned and run. But some stupid, primal part of me needed proof. Needed to touch it, to feel that it was just wood and nothing else. So I reached out. The moment my palm pressed against the bark, white-hot pain shot up my arm. It burned, not like fire, but like something was pulling at me, tearing at me. My vision blurred, and for the briefest moment, I wasn't in Yosemite anymore. I was inside the tree. I saw darkness, a void, faces surrounding me, their mouths stretched wide, their eyes gone. I felt myself screaming, but no sound came out. And then, release. I was back in the woods, on my knees, gasping for air. My hand was red. The skin blistered where I had touched the tree. The screaming had stopped. I didn't waste any more time. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping against my arms, my legs. But I didn't stop until I was back at the campsite, back by the dying fire. I dove into my tent and zipped it up tight, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Jake was still asleep. Didn't hear a thing, but I did. All night long, just outside my tent, I could hear the whispers. And the next morning, the tree was closer. Story 5. The Grand Canyon is supposed to be peaceful at night. Vast, silent, endless. That's what I told myself as I hiked the remote trail alone, the stars burning above like cold pinpricks in the sky. I was miles from anyone. No cell service, no artificial light. Just me, my pack, and the whisper of the wind over the rocks. That night, the silence felt different. Too still, too expectant. I first saw him when I stopped to take a sip from my water bottle. He was about 50 yards down the trail, just at the edge of my headlamp's glow. At first, I thought he was an animal. A coyote, maybe. The way he moved, low to the ground, jerky, limbs splayed at odd angles, looked unnatural. But when I focused, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a man crawling. His arms were spread wide, elbows bent wrong. His legs dragged behind him like they weren't his own. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could hear the dry scrape of his hands against the dirt, the slow, wet hitch of his breath. I swallowed hard. "Hey," I called. "You okay?" The crawling man froze. The night swallowed the sound, and suddenly, everything felt wrong. Like I'd broken some unspoken rule. Like I called something that shouldn't have been called. Then, slowly, too slowly, he moved. His spine twisted in a way that made my stomach clench. His bones seemed to shift beneath his skin. One of his arms cracked as he pushed himself up. His body contorted until he was kneeling there, hunched like a broken doll. His head was still dipped low, hidden in the shadows. I took a step back. "Hey, man," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "You need help." That's when he lifted his head. His face, God, his face. It was human, but wrong. The eyes too big, too dark. A smile that stretched too wide. The lips cracked and dry, like they'd been peeled back too far. Then, his neck snapped sideways, farther than a human neck should go. Further still, until his head was completely upside down. I ran. I didn't pause. Just turned and sprinted, heart hammering in my throat. My boots pounded against the packed dirt. My breath came in ragged gasps. But behind me, I could hear him. That same dry scraping. The shuffle of something dragging. He was crawling after me. The wind kicked up, filling the canyon with a low, mournful howl. My headlamp bobbed wildly as I ran, casting leaping shadows against the cliffs. I risked a glance back and saw him lurching forward on all fours, his body snapping into place like some grotesque marionette. And then, in the wind, beneath the rush of my blood, I heard it. A voice. A whisper. My name. It came from his mouth. I ran faster. I don't remember much after that. Just the blind panic, the desperate scramble to put distance between myself and that thing. At some point, I lost my footing, tripped, rolled hard onto my side, knocking the breath from my lungs. And then, nothing. The crawling sound was gone. The wind had died. I forced myself up, my heart slamming against my ribs. My headlamp flickered, the beam of light bouncing over the empty trail. Nothing but rocks and dust. But he had been there. I knew he had. I listened, held my breath, but there was only silence. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat there in my tent, knife in hand, waiting, praying I'd imagined it. At dawn, I packed up and practically ran back to the trailhead. When I reached my car, I slammed the door and locked it, my hands still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I forced myself to glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him crawling from the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty trailhead, the morning sun rising over the cliffs. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. I told myself it was exhaustion, dehydration, a trick of the light. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I still hear my name, whispered in the dark. Story 6. I don't know how to explain what happened in Zion that night. And honestly, I don't think I want to. Some things don't belong in words. Words make them real. And if I make this real, then that means it could happen again. But I need to tell someone. Because if I don't, I think the shadows might come back. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me and my best friend, Joel, out in the Utah wilderness for 3 nights. We were both experienced backpackers, had all the right gear, and had done this a dozen times before. Zion was breathtaking during the day, a cathedral of red rock and open sky. But at night, it was something else entirely. The air felt heavier. The quiet stretched too long. On the second evening, just as the sun was sinking behind the cliffs, we noticed something strange. Our shadows stretched across the dirt, long and spindly, like twisted, skeletal fingers reaching out toward the trees. That wasn't the weird part. Shadows always get longer at sunset. The weird part was that they kept growing, even after the sun had almost disappeared, when our bodies should have been barely casting a sliver of shadow at all. The dark shapes behind us stretched further and further. I remember laughing, nudging Joel and saying, "Look, we're turning into monsters." He didn't laugh. He was staring at his own shadow with a crease in his brow. "Dude," he said, voice low, "where's the light source?" I frowned and looked around. The sun was gone. There was no moon out yet. No campfire. No flashlight. No reason for us to have any shadows. And yet, there they were, slithering along the dirt, too long, too thin. And God, I still get chills thinking about this. They weren't still. They shifted, almost like they were breathing. Joel took a step back. His shadow stayed where it was for a split second too long, before snapping back to match his movement. That was the moment I felt it. This deep, awful certainty in my gut that we weren't alone. That something was watching us. We bolted. At first, it was just a normal run. Our boots pounded against the dirt, our breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. But then I glanced down and almost tripped over my own feet. The shadows were chasing us, not like normal shadows, shifting with our movement. No, these things had detached. They no longer mirrored our bodies, but slithered after us, closing the distance with impossible speed. I screamed. Joel cursed. We ran faster. The path twisted through the trees, the last bits of twilight making it just barely visible. Our car was parked about half a mile away at a trailhead, but every step felt like we weren't moving at all, like the forest was stretching longer, trapping us inside. Then, Joel tripped. I heard the crack as his knee hit a rock. He let out a strangled cry and tried to push himself up, but the shadows were already on him. His own black reflection stretched over his body like a living thing, its edges rising up like ink in water. I didn't think. I just grabbed his arm and yanked. For a second, I thought I was too late. His skin was ice cold under my grip, his pupils blown wide in terror. But then, with a sharp pop, like a suction cup being ripped off glass, the shadow let go. We didn't look back. The last 100 yards to the car were a blur of panic. I fumbled for the keys, yanked the door open, and practically shoved Joel inside before diving into the driver's seat. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Then, just as the engine roared to life, something moved in the rearview mirror. A shadow, sliding across the windshield. Inside the car, I slammed the gas. The tires spit gravel as we shot forward, speeding down the dirt road with the headlights barely illuminating the way. The shadow lingered, stretching over the glass like a stain, before slowly melting away. Neither of us spoke the entire drive back to town. The next morning, against every rational part of my brain, we went back. Our tent was still there, untouched, but when I unzipped it and looked inside, my stomach dropped. The entire interior was black. Not like dirt, not like mold charred. The fabric was burned from the inside out, the edges curling inward like something had sucked the light out of it. Joel and I didn't talk much after that trip. We tried, at first, tried to explain it away, tried to act like it had just been a trick of the light. But some things can't be explained. Some things don't need answers. Some things are just waiting. Story 7. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the silence of the woods, the way the trees swallow up sound, that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. It's peaceful. At least, that's what I used to think. I was deep in Olympic National Park, following a trail I had mapped out weeks in advance. It wasn't an official path, just an old, forgotten ranger trail, overgrown but still navigable. I'd read about it on some obscure hiker's forum. A hidden gem, someone called it. Peaceful, isolated, feels like you're stepping into another world. They weren't lying. The trees were massive, older than time itself. Their gnarled roots twisting like something out of a fairy tale. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to fold in around me. The air was thick, damp with the scent of moss and rotting wood. Every so often, I'd hear a bird call or the distant rustle of underbrush, but otherwise, it was just me and the forest. Then I noticed something off. It started small. The trail was narrower than I remembered. The ferns along the sides seemed taller. I brushed it off. Nature changes. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. But then I stopped to take a drink of water and glanced back. The trail was gone. Not overgrown. Not hidden. Just gone. Where I'd walked moments before was nothing but dense forest. Ancient trees stood shoulder to shoulder, their bark rough and dark, their trunks thick with moss. There was no break between them, no sign that any person had ever walked this way. I spun in a slow circle, my heart hammering against my ribs. The path ahead was still there. Behind me, solid trees. I told myself it was just the angle. Maybe the trees had closed in, or maybe the undergrowth was thicker than I thought. If I walked for a bit and turned back again, I'd see the trail. I just needed to keep moving, so I did. But every time I glanced back, the forest had swallowed more of the path. Panic started creeping in, a slow, creeping dread slithering up my spine. I checked my GPS, but the signal was fuzzy, like static on an old TV. The map showed my location, but it made no sense. According to the screen, I had been walking in circles for hours. That was impossible. I was following a straight path. My feet knew the rhythm, the steady pace of forward momentum. I wasn't looping back. I couldn't be. I turned back one last time. This time, the trees weren't just thick. They were wrong. Their bark was too smooth, almost like skin, pale and stretched too tight. Their branches twisted toward me, reaching, stretching, their dark leaves rustling without wind. I took a step back. The air around me was heavy, pressing against my ears, muffling sound like I was sinking underwater. Then I heard it, a voice. Keep walking. It was right behind me. I froze, my entire body locked up, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. If I turned around, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to see, something I couldn't unsee. Keep walking. The voice was close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck, but there was nothing. No warmth, no presence, just an empty, gaping void at my back. I ran. Branches clawed at me as I bolted forward, thorns tearing into my arms, my legs. My pack bounced against my back, but I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept running, tearing through the undergrowth like an animal fleeing a predator. Then, suddenly, I was in a clearing. I stumbled, nearly falling to my knees. The world around me snapped back to normal. The trees here were just trees. The air was crisp, cool. The pressure in my ears was gone. I turned, expecting to see that wall of trees again, but the trail was there, right where it should be. I stared at it, chest heaving, my mind refusing to make sense of what had just happened. The forest behind me was normal. No twisted trees, no reaching branches. Just a quiet, empty path leading back the way I'd come. I pulled out my GPS, hand shaking. My location was back to normal, but the timestamp was wrong. It said I'd been in that forest for over 3 hours. I checked the time on my phone. I had only been hiking for 45 minutes. I don't remember hiking back. I don't remember anything except the clearing, then suddenly being in my car, throwing my gear into the back seat with shaking hands. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't hike in Olympic National Park, and I never turn around when I hear something behind me. Story 8. Denali is supposed to be beautiful, untouched, a place where nature still reigns. But there are places out there that don't belong to us. Places we should never go. I learned that the hard way. I was on my third day kayaking through the national park, cutting through the glassy water of a remote lake, the kind you don't find on postcards, the kind you only find if you're looking for true isolation. No trails, no campsites, no rangers, just water and trees and sky. That was exactly what I wanted, until I realized I wasn't alone. It started as a shadow beneath me. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a cluster of rocks on a lake bed, but it was moving, pacing me. I paddled faster, pushing toward the narrow bend that led to the shallows. The shadow kept up. I slowed, and it slowed. That was when I knew. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a log. It was something else. Something watching me. A chill crept up my back, even though the sun was high and the air was warm. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just an oversized lake trout, maybe even a muskellunge. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then I saw it. The shadow rose, and a shape broke the surface just 10 feet from my kayak. A hand, not a fish's fin, not a bear's paw. A hand. It was massive, the skin gray and bloated like something that had been underwater far too long. The fingers were impossibly long, and the nails were black, jagged. It hovered there for a moment, dripping, reaching, and then it grabbed my paddle. I screamed and yanked, but it wouldn't let go. It was strong, impossibly strong. My arms burned as I fought for control, the kayak rocking wildly beneath me. The water around me churned, turning dark, murky, as if something was rising from below. Then all at once it let go. The force sent me tumbling backward, the kayak flipping. Cold water swallowed me whole. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I could see beneath the lake. There were no fish, no weeds, just darkness, and something huge, something ancient, something wrong drifting just below me. A face, or something close to a face, peering up through the gloom. Two pale eyes, empty and staring, and a mouth too wide, lips pulled back over jagged, broken teeth. It opened its mouth, and bubbles surged toward me. A sound filled my head, not in my ears, but inside my skull. A deep, hungry noise like something trying to speak, trying to pull me down. I kicked hard, breaking the surface with a gasp. The lake was still. No ripples, no waves, just a perfect, glassy surface like nothing had happened. I spun around, gasping, searching for my paddle. It was gone. No, not gone. Floating 30 feet away, like it had been thrown. I didn't stop to think. I swam for shore, lungs burning, every stroke feeling like something was just behind me, just beneath me, waiting for me to slow down. When I reached the bank, I collapsed onto the rocks, chest heaving. The silence was deafening. I sat there for hours, staring at the water, expecting to see that hand rise up again, expecting to see those eyes staring at me from just below the surface. But the lake was empty, like it had never been disturbed. I never went back for my kayak. I left it out there. Let the lake take it. Some things aren't worth retrieving. Some things should just be left alone.